On the morning of February 7, 1497, a Dominican friar named Girolamo Savonarola stood in the Piazza della Signoria in Florence and watched 40 cartloads of the city's most treasured possessions burn. Paintings by Botticelli, mirrors, books, musical instruments, gowns, cosmetics. Things people had spent their entire lives accumulating, because they believed those things made them somebody. Savonarola told them that none of it mattered. That importance built on possessions and vanity was a sandcastle waiting for tide. And for one strange, electric season in Florence, the most powerful families in Europe lined up to throw their own vanities into the fire, just to feel, for a moment, like they were part of something that actually counted. Within a year, Savonarola himself was burned in that same square. The crowd that once worshipped him watched him die without lifting a finger to stop it. Here is the part nobody tells you about importance. The kind that depends on what other people think of you can be built in a single bonfire-lit night, and it can be unbuilt just as fast. It is borrowed. It was never yours. And the moment the crowd's attention moves on, so does your significance. There is another kind of importance. It does not need an audience. It does not need applause. It is built slowly, in places no one is watching, by people who often never lived to see anyone notice. And it cannot be burned, because it was never made of paper and vanity in the first place. If you are watching this, you have probably asked yourself, somewhere in the quiet hours, whether you matter. Whether what you do counts for anything. Whether you are important, or just busy. In the next half hour, you are going to meet people who answered that question the hard way, and you are going to walk away from this video with the actual blueprint for becoming someone whose presence in a room changes the room, whether anyone claps for you or not. This is inner steel. And this is how you learn to be important. Let's start with a man who was already considered the single most powerful person in the entire civilized world, and who voluntarily walked away from it twice. His name was Lucius Quinctius Cincinnatus, and somewhere around 458 BC, Rome was in trouble. A neighboring people called the Equians had trapped a Roman army in a mountain pass, surrounded on all sides, with no way out. Rome was in a panic. The kind of panic where the normal rules stop applying and people start asking who can actually save us, not who deserves a turn. The Roman Senate sent messengers to a small farm outside the city. They found Cincinnatus there, not in a toga, not holding court, but plowing his own field with his own hands, dirt under his fingernails, sweat on his back, because that was simply how he lived when no one needed him for anything grander. The messengers told him Rome had named him dictator. Not in the modern sense of a tyrant who seizes power, but in the old Roman sense, total, temporary authority, given only in the worst emergencies, to one man trusted enough to wield it, and then hand it back. Picture the scene for a moment, because it is worth picturing. A delegation of senators, dressed in the formal regalia of the Republic, walking out past the city walls into farmland, finding the most powerful man in Rome's future standing in a furrow with mud on his hands. He did not even have time to put on proper clothing before they delivered the news. His wife reportedly had to fetch his toga from inside the house so he could receive the senators with any dignity at all. There was no staging here, no campaign, no moment engineered for effect. The power found him in the middle of ordinary work, which is exactly the kind of man Rome needed in that moment, because a man who is comfortable being found in mud is rarely a man hungry to be found on a throne. Cincinnatus did not ask for a parade. He did not ask what was in it for him. He wiped his hands, put on his toga, walked to Rome, took command of an emergency army, marched out, surrounded the Equian forces in turn, forced their surrender, and marched the trapped Roman army home in triumph. Here is the detail that should stop you cold. Historical accounts say the entire campaign, from the moment he picked up command to the moment the enemy laid down their arms, took 16 days. And then, with the entire might of Rome sitting in his hand, with soldiers who would have followed him into any future he wanted to build, with a city that owed him everything, Cincinnatus resigned his absolute power and went back to plowing his field. He did this not once, but reportedly twice in his life, called back to save Rome a second time decades later when another crisis demanded it, and stepping down again the moment the job was finished. Sit with what that means. The single most powerful man in Rome, a man who could have crowned himself king and very likely gotten away with it, chose to go back to dirt and obscurity, because his importance was never built on the position. It was built on being the kind of man Rome could trust with absolute power and know he would hand it back. That is the first wall you have to build in your mind today. Importance is not the size of the power you hold. It is what you do with power when no one could stop you from keeping it. Cincinnatus was not important because he commanded an army for 16 days. He was important because of who he chose to be on day 17. Most people spend their whole lives chasing the moment they get the power, the title, the platform, the recognition, believing that once they have it, they will finally be somebody. Cincinnatus already had it, twice, and gave it back, twice, and that is exactly why 2,500 years later, we are still saying his name. If you want people in your life, your family, your team, your friends, to trust you the way Rome trusted Cincinnatus, you do not earn that by reminding them how powerful you are. You earn it by proving, in the small moments when nobody's checking, that you will set down the power the moment the job is done. That is rare. That is unforgettable. That is importance with a foundation under it. Before we go further, if this kind of thinking is doing something for you right now, if something in your chest is sitting up straighter, take 3 seconds and subscribe to Inner Steel. Not because we're asking for a favor. Because there are 11 more of these waiting for you, and most people never come back for the next one, and the next one is usually the one that changes something. Now let's go to a man who, on paper, did the opposite of everything Cincinnatus did. He never commanded an army. He never held public office. He spent most of his life talking to puppets, sitting on the floor with small children, and wearing a cardigan his mother knitted for him. His name was Fred Rogers, and if you grew up anywhere near American television in the latter half of the 20th century, you knew him as Mr. Rogers. In 1969, a year after Fred Rogers had launched his quiet, slow-moving children's program, the United States Senate was holding hearings on whether to slash funding for public broadcasting. The man in charge of that subcommittee, Senator John Pastor, had a reputation. He was sharp, impatient, and visibly unimpressed by people who wasted his time. Witnesses before Fred Rogers had been cut off mid-sentence. Fred Rogers walked into that hearing room, sat down in front of a man who held the funding for his entire show in his hands, and instead of performing confidence, instead of throwing out statistics and talking points like the executives before him had done, he simply talked. He talked about feelings. He talked about how children need to be told it is all right to feel angry, all right to feel sad, all right to feel afraid, because if no one tells them that, they learn to handle those feelings in dangerous ways instead. Pastor, visibly skeptical, cutting off pleasantries the way he had with every witness before, asked him to just say what he had come to say. He had a budget to defend and a room full of competing priorities, and a man in a cardigan talking about feelings was not high on his list of things he expected to take seriously that morning.
Morning. So Fred Rogers, in a voice that never rose, that never performed urgency it didn't fail, began reciting the words to a song he had written for children about managing anger. About what you called to instead of hitting, instead of beating, instead of breaking your toys, when feelings got too big to hold. He did not raise his hands for emphasis. He did not lean forward to project authority the way every other witness in that hearing had been trained to he spoke the way he spoke to a 4-year-old on the other side of a camera lens because he believed correctly that truth was not need volume to land. By the end of it, the senator who had cut off witness after witness looked at his soft-spoken man in a cardigan and said, "I think it is wonderful." Looks like you just earned $20 million. Public broadcasting's funding, which had been on the chopping block, was protected that day, in large part because on a man refused to raise his voice, refused to posture, and simply told the truth about why gentleness mattered. Here is what almost everyone misjudges about Fred Rogers. They assume his gentleness was the absence of strength. It was the opposite. It talk an almost unbearable amount of internal discipline to sit in front of a powerful, impatient man and not perform. Not exaggerate. Not raise his voice to say more convincing. He trusted that the truth, delivered plainly, would to the work that posturing could not. Fred Rogers became one of the most quietly important men of the 20th century, not be paying the loudest voice in any room, but be paying the steadiest. Children trusted him because adults around them were chaotic, inconsistent, distracted, and he was not. He showed up the same way, every single day, for 33 years. This is the second truth about importance, and it cuts against almost everything the modern world is selling you. You do not need to be the loudest person in the room to be the most important on in it, you need to be the steadiest. Te on voose temperature toes not spikke when everyone else's toes. Te on people kanse teir watch be. Think about the people in your own life who you would call truly important to you. Odds are, very few of them got therapy being the most impressive talker at the party. Most of them got therapy being the person who picked up the phone at 2 in the morning. They on who showed up the same, calm way, every single time, no matter what was happening around them. You built that kind of importance on a boring, consistent day at a time. Not with a single dramatic gesture, but with the same steady presence, repeated so many times that people stop being able to imagine their life without it. Now let's talk about a man whose importance the world refused to recognize while he was alive, and whose discovery could have saved the lives of millions of women if anyone had simply listened to him. His name was Ignaz Semmelweis, a Hungarian physician working in a Vienna hospital in the 1840s. At the time, pneumoters were thing at a horrifying rate from something called childbed fever, sometimes losing as many as one in 5 women shortly after delivery. Doctors of the era had no idea why, and many simply accepted it as one of the tragic, unavoidable costs of childbirth. Semmelweis noticed something strange. In his hospital, there were 2 maternity wards. One staffed by doctors and medical students. The other staffed by midwives. The ward run by doctors had a rate several times higher than the ward run by midwives. He started digging for the difference, and he found it in the autopsy room. Doctors and medical students in that era would routinely move from dissecting cadavers, including women who had died of childbed fever, directly to examining and delivering living patients, without washing their hands. The midwives never performed autopsies at all. Semmelweis proposed something that sounds laughably obvious to us now and was considered nearly insulting at the time. He suggested doctors wash their hands with a chlorinated lime solution before touching patients. When his colleagues at the hospital implemented it, the mortality rate in the doctors ward dropped by a staggering amount, in some reports falling from around 18% down to near 2% within a year. You would think this discovery would have made Ignaz Semmelweis one of the most celebrated men in medicine. Instead, the medical establishment of Vienna mocked him. The idea that a gentleman doctor's hands could carry invisible particles of disease offended their sense of professional dignity. Germ theory did not yet exist as an accepted framework, and Semmelweis could not explain the mechanism, only the results. Without a tidy theory to wrap around his evidence, his peers dismissed him as an embarrassment, a man making wild accusations against his own colleagues. He grew increasingly desperate to be believed, increasingly blunt and combative in trying to force the medical world to listen, and it cost him his career, his reputation, and eventually, by most historical accounts, his sanity. He died in 1865 in an asylum after being committed partly due to his erratic behavior, from an infected wound, the bitter irony being that it may have been the very kind of infection his own discovery could have prevented. It was not until years after his death, on the Louis Pasteur and Joseph Lister had built the germ theory of disease that had explained why semmelweis had been rigged all along, that the medical world finally recognized what he had found. Hand hygiene before a patient contact is now one of the most basic, non-negotiable standards in all of medicine, a rule that has saved more lives than almost any single medical practice in history. Here is what makes Ignas Semmelweis matter to you, watching this video, almost 200 years later. He never got the recognition. He never got the parade, the funding, the credit. He did believing he had failed. And he was still, without question, one of the most important men in the history of medicine, because the importance is not the same thing as being recognized for your contribution. It is the size and reality of the contribution itself. This is a hard truth, but it not saying plainly. Some of the most important things you will ever do in your life might never be uploaded. The parent who breaks a cycle of neglect that no outside the family will ever know existed. The employee who quietly fixes a problem that would have cost the company everything and never tells anyone it was them. The friend who says the honest thing that changes the direction of someone's life and is forgotten by next week. If you are waiting for the recognition to arrive before you believe you matter, you may be waiting the way Semmelweis did. The discipline is to do the important thing regardless of whether the parade ever comes. Let the importance live in the act itself, not in the crowd's verdict on the act. Let us go to someone whose importance come from an entirely different direction. Not from being unheard, but from refusing to let suffering make her invisible. Her name was Florence Nightingale, and in 1854, during the Crimean War, she arrived at a British military hospital in Scutari to find conditions that can only be described as a slaughterhouse disguised as a place of healing. Soldiers were dying not primarily from battle wounds, but from infection, malnutrition, and disease packed into filthy wards with overflowing sewage, contaminated water, and almost no real sanitation. Historical estimates suggest that for every soldier who died of a wound, several more died of preventable disease in those hospitals. Nightingale was 34 years old, from a wealthy family that had expected her to live a comfortable, ornamental life of marriage and social goals. She had instead trained as a nurse against her family's wishes, at a time when nursing was considered a low, almost disreputable occupation for a woman of her class. When she arrived in Scutari with a small team of nurses, she walked into wards where wounded and dying men lay on bare floors because there were not enough beds, where rats moved freely through corridors, where the drinking water ran through pipes that also carried waste from the latrines. The smell alone, by multiple accounts from soldiers who survived it, was something men who had already survived combat described as worse than the battlefield. The military doctors did not want her there. They saw her as an interference, an amateur, a woman meddling in matters of military medicine. She did not argue her way into authority. She went to work. She scrubbed the wards herself. She organized proper food distribution so soldiers were not slowly starving in their beds. She pushed for clean water and proper sewage management. She kept meticulous statistical records of every death and its cause, because she understood something almost no one else in that hospital understood. If you could not prove the problem with numbers, the people in charge would never believe it was real. Within roughly 6 months of her sanitary reforms being implemented, the death rate at that hospital plummeted dramatically, by some accounts dropping from over 40% down to a small fraction of that. She did not do this with a title. She had no formal command authority over the doctors or the military hierarchy. She did it by being relentlessly, undeniably useful, night after night, in a place everyone else wanted to look away from. When she returned to England, she did not coast on her fame. She spent the rest of her life turning her wartime observations into a science. She pioneered the use of statistical graphics, including a now famous Rose diagram, to make medical data impossible to ignore. She wrote the book that essentially founded modern nursing as a respected profession. She pushed sanitary reform through the British military and civilian hospital systems for decades after the war that made her famous had ended. Florence Nightingale became important not because she demanded a seat at the table, but because she made herself the most useful person in the worst room in the empire, and then she turned that on a act of usefulness into a lifetime of systemic change. There is a pattern forming here, and you should notice it Cincinnatus became important by handing back power. Fred Rogers became important by refusing to perform. Semmelweis was important even when unrecognized. Florence Nightingale became important by making herself indispensable in the room everyone else avoided. None of them waited for permission. None of them waited to be told they were ready. They simply located the place where their effort mattered most, and they went there. If something in you is starting to recognize that pattern in your own life right now, the rooms you have been avoiding, the unglamorous work you have been putting off, that recognition is worth holding on to. And if you want the rest of these stories, the honest heart get even more specific about how to build this kind of importance brick by brick, stay with inner style. Subscribe now, because the next point is going to ask something of you that most people are not willing to give. Here is what most people are not willing to give. They are not willing to be unimportant for a long time, on purpose, while they build the thing that will actually matter. Let me show you what that looks like through the life of John Coltrane. By the late 1950s, Coltrane was a working saxophonist, talented, respected within certain circles, but not yet the towering figure jazz would later remember. He had played with Miles Davis, been fired at on a point for struggles with addiction, gotten himself clean through what he later described as a profound spiritual awakening, and rejoined the scene determined to find something deeper in his music than he had before. Most musicians at his level of skill would have settled into a comfortable career playing the standards, touring, collecting a respectable living doing variations on what already worked. Coltrane did something almost nobody around him understood at the time. He became famously, obsessively dedicated to practicing far beyond what his existing success required. Musicians who knew him during this period describe a man who practiced for hours every single day, running scales and harmonic exercises with an intensity that seemed almost excessive for someone already considered a top-tier professional. He would fall asleep with the saxophone still in his hands, sometimes walking in the middle of the night to work through an idea that had come to him in a half dream before it slipped away. He kept notebooks filled with diagrams of scales and short relationships that looked less like a musician's sketches and more like a mathematician's proofs, circles and patterns mapping out harmonic possibilities most working musicians never bothered to chart. He was reportedly so consumed with exploring the mathematical and harmonic possibilities of music that he once cornered fellow jazz giant Thelonious Monk just to talk through chord theory for hours, treating a casual moment like a graduate seminar. He was not doing this because anyone was demanding it of him. He had already reached a level most musicians never reach. He kept going because he had decided that competence was not the finish line. He wanted to find sounds that did not exist yet. In 1959, that obsessive foundation produced Giant Steps, a composition built on chord changes so rapid and unconventional that they are still used as one of the standard tests of mastery for jazz musicians learning to improvise today, more than 6 decades later. A few years after that came A Love Supreme, a 4-part suite that many critics consider one of the most spiritually significant recordings in the history of American music, an album that was not really about technical showmanship at all anymore, but about gratitude, devotion, and a kind of musical prayer. Coltrane died young at 40 years old from liver cancer in 1967. But by the time he died, he had fundamentally altered the vocabulary of an entire art form. Musicians who come after him across multiple genres are still working through ideas he introduced. His importance was not handed to him by an institution. It was built scale by scale, hour by hour, in practice rooms where nobody was watching and no one would have known if he had simply stopped.
Here is the question this should put in front of you. What are you doing right now, in the hours nobody sees, that has nothing to do with impressing anyone and everything to do with becoming someone who could not have existed a year ago? Most people only put in effort when an audience is present to witness it. Coltrane's most important hours were the ones alone in a room with a saxophone and no one clapping. That is where his importance was actually manufactured. The stage only revealed what the practice room had already built. Let's go somewhere that has nothing to do with music, and everything to do with what happens when a person decides their importance will be measured by service, not by status. In 1854, a British Army officer named James Brudenell, the Earl of Cardigan, led 670 cavalrymen directly into the mouth of Russian artillery at the Battle of Balaclava, in what became known as the Charge of the Light Brigade, due to a catastrophic series of miscommunications up the chain of command. Within roughly 20 minutes, well over 100 men were killed and many more wounded, in an assault that achieved essentially nothing of military value. We remember that charge today largely because of a poem written by Alfred Lord Tennyson. But there is a quieter story buried in that same war that deserves at least as much of your attention. A few miles from that battlefield, a doctor named John Hall and a nurse named Florence Nightingale, who you already met, were not the only people trying to undo the damage that war was doing to ordinary men. There was also a woman named Mary C. Cole, of Jamaican and Scottish heritage, who had learned traditional medical and herbal treatment from her mother, who ran a boarding house for sick and convalescing soldiers and sailors back home. When the Crimean War broke out, Mary C. Cole traveled to London at her own expense and applied to join the official nursing corps being assembled to go help the soldiers. She was turned away. Some accounts suggest the rejection was tied to the prejudices of her era regarding her race. Undeterred, she funded her own passage to Crimea, and once there, built her own establishment near the front lines, which she called the British Hotel, where she provided food, medical care, and basic comforts to sick and wounded soldiers, often venturing onto the battlefield itself, under fire, to tend to the wounded where they fell. Soldiers who survived the war rode home describing her almost as a folk hero, a woman who showed up where the official channels had failed them, who treated them with a warmth and competence that made the chaos of war feel slightly less inhumane. She received no official government commission, no formal recognition during her lifetime comparable to what other figures of that war received, and for over a century after her death in 1881, she was largely written out of the mainstream history of that conflict. It has only been in recent decades that historians and the public have worked to restore her place in that history, recognizing that she was every bit as vital to the soldiers she treated as anyone given an official title. Mary C. Cole was told, formally, through official channels, that she was not needed. She decided that verdict did not get to define her importance, paid her own way into a war zone, and built her significance with her own hands, in a place where the people she helped could feel the difference immediately, whether or not the official record ever caught up. This is the third truth, and it might be the hardest one to actually live by. Sometimes the institutions in your life, the company, the family system, the social circle, will tell you that you are not needed, that there is no room for you, that your contribution does not count. Their verdict is not the final word on your importance. It is only the final word if you let it be. You do not need permission from the gatekeepers to become someone whose presence matters. You need a place that needs help, and the willingness to show up there anyway, on your own terms, the way Mary C. Cole did. Let's talk about a man whose importance was built in almost total isolation, on a continent where there was no audience at all, only ice, silence, and the threat of death. In 1914, the explorer Ernest Shackleton, who you may already know from other stories told on this channel, set sail for Antarctica aboard a ship called the Endurance, attempting to be the first expedition to cross the continent on foot. The Endurance never reached land. It became trapped in pack ice, was slowly crushed over the course of months, the hull groaning and splitting under pressure the men could hear at night like the ship itself was dying around them, and eventually sank, leaving Shackleton and his 27-man crew stranded on the ice with 3 small lifeboats, and almost no realistic hope of rescue. There is a detail from that ordeal that gets less attention than the famous open boat journey Shackleton later made to reach help, and it deserves more attention than it gets. Among the crew was a young man named Perce Blackborough, a stowaway who had snuck aboard the ship as a teenager hoping for adventure. During the brutal months stranded on the ice and later on the desolate, freezing rocks of Elephant Island, Blackborough developed severe frostbite in his feet. With no proper medical facility, no anesthesia beyond what little they had on hand, and a ship's surgeon working in primitive conditions, several of his toes had to be amputated to save his life. While this was happening, Shackleton made a decision that tells you everything about how he understood his own importance as the leader of this expedition. He did not retreat to whatever passed for officers' quarters and let the crew handle their own morale. He stayed close to his men. He made a point, repeatedly documented by crew members in their diaries, of personally checking on the weakest and most vulnerable members of the party, giving away his own mittens to a man whose hands were freezing, making sure the men who were suffering most never felt forgotten or expendable. When Shackleton eventually set off in a small lifeboat called the James Caird on one of the most extraordinary open-ocean rescue voyages in maritime history, crossing 800 miles of the most violent seas on Earth to reach a whaling station on South Georgia Island, he left behind a second-in-command, Frank Wild, with strict instructions on how to keep the remaining men alive and hopeful during what could have been many more months of waiting. When Shackleton finally returned with a rescue ship, every single member of his crew was still alive. 28 men went into one of the most lethal environments on the planet, and 20 men came home. Here is what made Shackleton important, and it is not simply that he survived an extraordinary ordeal. It is that his understanding of leadership inverted the usual hierarchy. He treated his importance as a leader to be measured by how thoroughly he served the weakest member of his crew, not by how comfortably he insulated himself from the suffering everyone else endured. Compare that to how so many people today imagine importance. They imagine it as insulation, as getting to a position where other people serve you, where you no longer have to deal with the hard, unglamorous parts of the work. Shackleton's entire legacy argues the opposite. The moment he became most important to his men was the moment he was crouched beside the sickest man on the ice, giving away his own gloves. If you want to know whether you are actually becoming important to the people in your life, do not ask whether they admire you from a distance. Ask whether they would trust you to be the one who shows up when things are at their absolute worst. That is the real test, and it is the only one that matters. Now I want to take you to a very different kind of ice, the kind that exists inside the human mind, and introduce you to a researcher named Barbara McClintock. In the 1940s and 1950s, McClintock was a geneticist studying corn plants, painstakingly tracking patterns of color and inheritance across generations of maize. Through years of meticulous observation, she arrived at a conclusion that the scientific establishment of her time found almost impossible to accept. She proposed that genes were not fixed, permanently stationary points on a chromosome, as nearly every geneticist at the time believed, but that certain genetic elements could actually move from one location to another, what she called transposition, and that this movement could explain previously mysterious patterns in how traits appeared and disappeared across generations. When she presented these findings to her peers in 1951, the reception was, by most historical accounts, somewhere between baffled silence and open skepticism. The idea contradicted foundational assumptions in the field. Several of her colleagues reportedly considered the work too complex, too strange, or simply implausible to take seriously. For years afterward, McClintock found herself increasingly isolated within her scientific community. Her papers cited far less than the importance of the work deserved, her conclusions treated as an interesting curiosity rather than the field-altering discovery they actually were. She did not stop working. She continued her research largely on her own terms at Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory, maintaining her meticulous standards even as much of the broader scientific community moved on without fully reckoning with what she had found. It would take roughly 3 decades, as molecular biology developed new tools capable of directly observing the genetic mechanisms she had inferred purely from breeding patterns and careful observation, for the scientific establishment to fully recognize what she had been right about all along. In 1983, Barbara McClintock was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine, becoming the first woman to win that prize unshared, for discoveries that the world had spent 30 years failing to properly credit. When asked later in life how she endured those decades of being dismissed, McClintock reportedly said something to the effect that if you know you are right, you do not need the world's agreement to keep working. The satisfaction was in understanding something true, not in being told by others that you understood it. This is the same pattern you saw with Semmelweis, but with a crucial difference in outcome. Both were right years before anyone believed them. Semmelweis was consumed by the need to be vindicated, and it broke him before vindication arrived. McClintock built an internal sense of importance sturdy enough to survive 30 years of being underestimated, because her sense of her own significance was never outsourced to the committee that kept overlooking her. That distinction matters enormously for how you build your own importance. It is not enough to simply do important work and wait. You also have to build the internal architecture that can hold steady while the recognition, if it ever comes at all, takes its time. Otherwise, the gap between what you know you are worth and what the world is currently willing to admit can hollow you out from the inside, the way it nearly did to Semmelweis. Protect that internal architecture the way you would protect anything else essential to your survival. Do not let other people's slowness to recognize your worth convince you that the worth was never real. There is one more story you need before we put this all together, because it answers a question you might be quietly asking by now. What if you have already wasted years? What if you feel like you are starting this too late to matter? Before we get there, though, there is a story about a man who became important in a single afternoon, after years of being almost nobody at all, and the contrast it offers is worth sitting with. Joshua Chamberlain was a college professor of rhetoric in Maine, a quiet academic who taught languages and public speaking, with no military background whatsoever, when the Civil War broke out in 1861. He volunteered anyway, was given a commission largely because Maine needed officers and Chamberlain was educated and willing, and spent his early months in uniform doing what most green officers did, learning slowly, making mistakes, being entirely unremarkable in the eyes of the men above him. By July of 1863, Chamberlain commanded the 20th Maine Regiment, and found himself holding the far left flank of the entire Union line at a place called Little Round Top, during the second day of the Battle of Gettysburg. If that flank broke, Confederate forces could have swept around behind the entire Union army, very possibly changing the outcome of the battle and, by extension, the trajectory of the war itself. His men were exhausted, badly outnumbered, and running desperately low on ammunition after repelling wave after wave of Confederate assaults up a rocky, wooded hillside through the brutal heat of a Pennsylvania summer afternoon. Many of them had fired their last rounds. Retreat would have been the conventional choice, and arguably the safer one for a position that could no longer sustain a defensive firefight. Chamberlain, the former rhetoric professor with no formal military training to draw on in that instant, made a decision that has been studied by military historians ever since. Instead of retreating, he ordered his depleted regiment to fix bayonets and charge down the hill directly into the advancing Confederate line, a tactic so unexpected from a defending force running out of bullets that it broke the momentum of the attack entirely. The maneuver worked. The line held. Historians have argued for over a century about exactly how decisive that single charge was to the overall battle, but there is little dispute that the Union flank could have collapsed that afternoon without it. Chamberlain had spent the first half of his adult life as an unremarkable academic. He spent the first 2 years of the war as an unremarkable junior officer. He became, in the space of one violent afternoon on a hillside in Pennsylvania, a man whose decision is still taught in military academies more than a century and a half later. He did not know, climbing that hill with his exhausted men, that this would be the afternoon history remembered him for. He simply made the most disciplined, clear-headed decision he was capable of making, with the resources he actually had, in the moment demanded it. Moment demanded it. This matters because it complicates the pattern slightly, in a way you need to hear. Sometimes importance is built slowly, the way Coltrane built his, mile by practice session by unglamorous mile. And sometimes it arrives suddenly, in a single afternoon, after years of quiet, unremarkable preparation that never looked like it was leading anywhere in particular. Chamberlain could not have predicted Little Round Top. What he could control, in all those unremarkable months before it, was becoming the kind of disciplined, clear-thinking man who would make the right call when the moment finally arrived without warning. You do not always get to choose whether your test comes as a slow accumulation or a sudden afternoon. What you can choose, every single day before that test arrives, is whether you are becoming someone capable of meeting it. In 1908, a Finnish farmhand and former soldier named Hannes Kalamainen was working long, grinding days of physical labor, the kind of work that builds endurance without anyone ever calling it training. He was poor, largely self-taught in anything resembling structured athletics, and had no formal coaching, no sports science, none of the institutional support that the wealthier athletic programs of other nations could offer their competitors. He began running, mostly alone, across the Finnish countryside, working out by instinct and sheer repetition what worked and what did not. By the 1912 Stockholm Olympics, this farmhand with no formal training infrastructure had become one of the most feared long-distance runners in the world, winning 3 gold medals at those games, including the 10,000-meter race and the demanding individual cross-country event, setting records that stood for years. What Kalamainen helped ignite, almost by accident, was a running tradition in Finland that would go on to dominate world distance running for the better part of the next 2 decades, a phenomenon historians later nicknamed the Flying Finns. Runners with no glamorous origin story, just brutal Nordic winters, long hours of unglamorous labor, and an emerging belief that they belonged on the same start line as anyone else in the world. Kalamainen did not get a head start. He did not get the resources that should have made him competitive on a global stage. He simply put in mile after unglamorous mile, in obscurity, with no one watching, no certainty it would ever amount to anything, until one day it amounted to an Olympic record. If you feel behind right now, understand that almost everyone in this video felt behind at some point. Mary Seacole was rejected by the official nursing corps and built her significance anyway, starting essentially from zero in a foreign war zone. Coltrane was a working musician for years before the obsessive practice that produced giant steps. Barbara McClintock spent 3 decades unrecognized. None of them got to skip the obscure, unglamorous middle section of the story. They simply refused to let the obscurity convince them that the work did not matter. There is no version of becoming important that skips the years where nobody is watching. Every single person in this video walked through that stretch. The only difference between the ones history remembers and the ones it forgot is that the remembered ones kept walking. Now let's bring this all the way back to where we started, in that square in Florence, watching Savonarola's bonfire of vanities burn down to ash. What Savonarola understood, even if he ultimately built his own importance on the wrong foundation, was that most of what people chase in order to feel significant is exactly that fragile. Vanity, status, the approval of a crowd that can turn on you within a year, all of it burns fast, and what is left after the fire tells you what was real and what was only decoration. Cincinnatus handed back the most powerful position in the ancient world, twice, because his importance was never about holding power. It was about being trustworthy with it. Fred Rogers sat in front of a skeptical senator and refused to raise his voice, because his importance was built on steadiness, not performance. Semmelweis died unrecognized but was right, and his importance never depended on the world catching up to him in time. Florence Nightingale made herself indispensable in the one hospital everyone else wanted to avoid. Mary Seacole was told she was not needed and built her significance anyway, on her own terms, in a war zone. John Coltrane spent thousands of hours alone in a practice room becoming someone the stage had not yet met. Joshua Chamberlain spent years as an unremarkable academic and an unremarkable officer, and became disciplined enough in private to meet the one afternoon that demanded everything he had. Ernest Shackleton measured his own importance by how well he served the weakest man on the ice. Barbara McClintock protected her sense of her own worth for 30 years while the world failed to see what she already knew was true. And Hannes Kalamainen ran mile after obscure mile until obscurity turned, almost without him noticing the exact moment, into history. None of them are in this story because a crowd decided to celebrate them in the moment. Several of them were dismissed, rejected, or ignored by the very institutions that should have recognized them immediately. What makes every one of them important, what makes their names worth your time 2 centuries or 2.5 millennia later, was never the applause. It was the architecture underneath it. The discipline. The willingness to do the necessary thing whether or not anyone was clapping. The refusal to let rejection, slowness, or silence be the final verdict on their worth. That is the actual blueprint for becoming important, and you already have everything you need to start building it today. First, hold power, responsibility, or advantage the way Cincinnatus held it. Loosely. Ready to set it down the moment the job is finished, because your trustworthiness, not your title, is what people will remember. Second, build your presence the way Fred Rogers built his. Through steadiness repeated so many times that people stop being able to imagine their life without it, rather than through performances designed to impress for a single moment. Third, separate the truth of your work from the world's willingness to recognize it, the way Semmelweis never could and Barbara McClintock managed to. Do the right thing because it is right, and protect your own sense of its worth even when no one else is ready to agree yet. Fourth, find the room everyone else is avoiding, the hospital ward, the unglamorous task, the unwanted job, the way Florence Nightingale did, and become so useful there that your presence becomes undeniable. Fifth, when an institution tells you that you are not needed, let Mary Seacole's example remind you that their verdict is not the final word. Find another way in, fund your own passage if you have to, and let your work speak in a language rejection cannot translate. Sixth, spend the hours nobody is watching the way John Coltrane spent his, not performing for an audience that is not there yet, but becoming the person who will eventually deserve the audience that is coming. Seventh, measure your importance to the people around you the way Shackleton measured his. Not by how far you have insulated yourself from their suffering, but by how close you are willing to stay to whoever among you is struggling most. Eighth, prepare in private the way Joshua Chamberlain prepared, even when nothing around you looks like it is leading anywhere, because you will rarely get advance warning for the one afternoon that ends up mattering most. And ninth, when you feel behind, remember Hannes Kalamainen, running alone through a Finnish winter with no coach, no funding, and no certainty, because the unglamorous middle of your story is not a sign you have failed. It is simply the part of the story that comes before the part people remember. You are not important because a crowd decided to clap for you tonight. You were never going to be important that way, and if you are honest with yourself, you already knew that, somewhere underneath all the noise telling you otherwise. You become important the same way every single person in this video did. Quietly. Repeatedly. In rooms no one else wanted to enter, on days no one else was watching, doing work that did not ask permission to matter before it mattered. Start today. Not when you feel ready. Not when someone notices. Today, in whatever unglamorous room is waiting for you. If this gave you something to carry into that room, subscribe to Inner Steel. There are more of these waiting, and the next one might be the story that finally convinces you to stop waiting for the bonfire to clap before you decide your life is worth building. This is Inner Steel. Go be important where no one is watching. That is the only place it has ever actually been built.